I want to thank everyone again for joining us. And I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Fran Mahon. I always get it wrong. Fran is a research fellow at the Preservation Society of Newport County, where he's developing a digital archive regarding the American Gilded Age and Progressive Era. His most recent article, The Colonial City, Eden, Amazonia, and the Humanist Imagination, was published by the University of Buffalo's Institute for European and Mediterranean Archaeology journal, Chronica, in 2021. He has a marked interest in the construction of heritage and history making and enjoys all things pirate. So Fran, thank you again for joining us. We're really looking forward to it, and I'll toss it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Caitlin. And let me get my screen up. Ooh. There we go. Okay. Hopefully that looks good on everyone's end. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Caitlin, for that introduction and for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm excited that we can all gather electronically for Dutch American Heritage Day in order to discuss history, heritage, and the island of St. Eustatius. So jumping right in quantifiable terms, the Caribbean island of St. Eustatius, located here on the map and on this inset, otherwise known as Statia, is a small place. It is a leeward island lying slightly northwest of St. Kitts and Nevis and just southeast of Puerto Rico in the Virgin Islands. It is approximately 11.8 square miles with a current population of roughly 3,200 people. It houses one dormant volcano, the Quill, on its southern coast, 3 national parks, one being an underwater marine park, kind of roughly located around here, and 5 northern hills and mountains, starting with Signal Hill to Boven Mountain, that are remnants of a prehistoric volcanic eruption. It garners about 44 inches of rainfall per year, produces roughly 45% of its own energy from a renewable solar power grid located in the middle of the island, right about here, and contains one cliff-dwelling city, Oranjestad, which is split in 2 between Upper Town and Lower Town. So this image on the left I have is taken from Lower Town. So you can see here some wharves and old warehouses. And then here's Upper Town with the city's fort, Fort Oranje. Statia is a Dutch Caribbean island, a special municipality of the Netherlands, or in other words, a public body or entity of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. This means that similar to the US overseas territories of Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, and Guam, the laws and citizens of St. Eustatius operate under a framework of Dutch governance, and the local station government ultimately defers to the Netherlands. While this relationship can be hard to understand at times, in February 2018, Dutch authorities dissolved Statia's democratically elected government, terminating members of the Island Council, the highest administrative body on the island, in exchange for a Hague-appointed government commissioner, and deputy commissioner. The island operated under direct Dutch rule for roughly 2 years before the partial restoration of democratically elected council members in October 2020, so just last year. Statia and its people seemingly belong to the Dutch government. Like many small places, it is often thought of as odd, sheltered, and secluded. And while its 18th century ruins, crystal clear water, and free roaming goat population, pictured on the left, paint it as a picturesque and somewhat isolated community, its history tells a different story. Before jumping further into the presentation tonight, however, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and my connection to Statia, really why I'm talking to you tonight about it. Ooh. I studied anthropology and art history at the University of Delaware from 2014 to 2018, where I became interested in marine archaeology. In 2017, I embarked on my first underwater excavation in St. Augustine, Florida, through the St. Augustine Lighthouse's Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program, or LAMP for short, which is where the picture on the right was taken of me. This experience was a trial by fire, as I had no diving experience prior to it, and diving conditions off the coast of St. Augustine are not ideal. Strong currents, low visibility, and unexpected summer weather patterns meant that most days I'd end up at home, exhausted and sunburnt, but excited for what tomorrow might bring. And just to give you a taste for what some of the diving conditions are like in St. Augustine, I have two videos for you. This first one is, I would say, average visibility for dives. So essentially you can't really see anything. And then this next video is probably what I would say is best visibility we ever had on site. So. A little better visibility, still a little foggy, a little silty, but at least, we could actually see stuff in front of us. The field school ended with the discovery of the previous summer's buried grids. What you saw in that last video, that's what we were working on, and a beer can. I can get into this later during the Q&A if anyone's interested. Following a roughly 6-month period, where I was firmly set on dry land back in Delaware, I left for Statia in early 2018 to dive with the St. Eustatius Center for Archaeological Research, or CCAR for short. Again, the picture on the right is from this field expedition. If diving conditions off the coast of St. Augustine are hellish, Statia's marine environments are heaven on earth. Near infinite visibility, relatively calm waters, and preserved shipwrecks dating back almost 300 years. So this first image was taken on site just to kind of give you an idea, one, of the visibility, but also two, of the wildlife. Statia's marine environment is pretty much teeming with animals. So we had visitors almost every day, almost every dive. Then this image is just illustrating actually on site what we were working on. So again, really good diving conditions, great visibility. And then if you actually look in the foreground, this is a spoon. We determined the shipwreck, was probably from the 18th century. So it's probably most likely an 18th century spoon. You can see we had already tagged it as well. And then just to give you a more broader idea of Statia's marine environment and marine archaeology as well, this was also taken on site. You can see two divers surveying, so marking out and plotting where artifacts are. We have our little clipboards here. Here's an artifact tag. And then here's just your friendly neighborhood turtle we had visit us one day. All right. I left Statia at the end of January, only to return again in July 2018 in order to lead an underwater survey this time. I should add a big thank you to my work supervisor at the time, Bridget Warner, and the Zwaanendael Museum for letting me take time off in order to conduct this specific project. Thank you, Bridget, and the museum. The goal of the July dive was to survey for a possible shipwreck, which we inevitably ended up finding on our last day. So the image to the right is of my team and I, and then the image to the left, which is more of a glamour shot, is of part of the actual site we were surveying. So here you can see the rulers we were using to orient the photo, and then this in the foreground is some sort of ceramic jar, some fragment of a ceramic jar that we documented, which inevitably ended up helping us determine that we were actually on a shipwreck site. And then this was on our last day, our last dive, and then again, just kind of illustrating what Statia's marine life is like. So here's a remora or a shark sucker that decided to pop on by. Okay. Fast forward 3 years, and I'm currently coming to you from Newport, Rhode Island in all its nautical glory, where I work as a research fellow for the local preservation society on a digital archiving project. While I still enjoy reading about marine archaeological excavations and surveys, I'm relatively happy here on dry land, away from the sharks, jellyfish, and sea urchins of the ocean. Furthermore, my interests have slightly changed from diving on historical wrecks to investigating the ways in which we craft, make, and ultimately produce history. My current position at the Preservation Society of Newport County requires me to think about where history comes from, how it is crafted, and ultimately how it is presented to and received by the public. In essence, it requires me to think about the ways memory, power, and time intersect in order to produce heritage and history. Through my research, I have come to understand memory as the material and immaterial stories, things, and people from the past that we remember. Power, as it relates to systems of institutional control and authority in regards to one's access to the past, or in other words, a person's access to memory. And time, concerning how time moves linearly from A to B to C, past to present to future, and non-linearly with the idea that all time lives as one. This probably sounds much more science fiction-y than it actually is, and I'll come back to this idea in just a moment. Ultimately, memory, power, and time intersect through the act of preservation, which according to the dictionary is, quote, the activity or process of keeping something valued alive, intact, or free from damage or decay, end quote. The idea being that to preserve both heritage and history, physical things like historic houses, artifacts, and documents, alongside immaterial things such as family recipes, fairy tales, and oral stories, allow us to remember where we came from and imagine where we might go. In the end, the act of preservation, the choice of saying we should remember this, is a powerful act that transcends time. Furthermore, preservation has consequences. The stories, ideas, and people we choose to remember from the past influence and often produce the cultural values, economic policies, and political representation of our present and future. As an example, I'd like to draw your attention to the New York City AIDS Memorial in Greenwich Village. This memorial was dedicated in 2016 in order to honor and remember the more than 100,000 New Yorkers who have died from AIDS complications since the early 1980s. Its location marks the physical site where St. Vincent's Hospital once stood, the hospital which housed the first and largest AIDS ward on the East Coast. As a memorial, it preserves not only the site of St. Vincent's, but also the lives and memories of those stigmatized by the public because of their HIV status. Additionally, remembering and honoring those currently living with HIV and those who have died from AIDS-related complications has proven instrumental in legislating responses to our present COVID-19 pandemic. UNAIDS, whose logo is on the left, the United Nations Joint Program on HIV/AIDS, which brings 11 UN organizations together to educate the public surrounding HIV and AIDS diagnosis, released a series of documents in 2020 on how governments could best address the spread and effects of COVID-19. One of their brochures, pictured here on the right, details 7 takeaways learned from the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic that governments should follow in order to implement a sustainable, community-centered COVID-19 response. Furthermore, they explicitly reference that, quote, 40 years of responding to the HIV epidemic has generated significant experience and lessons learned on the importance of a human rights-based approach to ensuring effective and proportionate responses to epidemics, end quote. A majority of the medical processes, government legislation, and social activism that we are seeing today in response to COVID-19 are descendant from lessons learned from remembering the beginning of the HIV epidemic. In essence, the preservation of sites, stories, and memories like the New York City AIDS Memorial has influenced our current social and political pandemic responses. Preservation is political. There is a reason why it took almost 30 years for the New York City AIDS Memorial to be erected. Preservation also takes time, money, and effort, and thus, remembering the past implies a person, place, or thing is significant and quote-unquote worthy of remembrance. This is why events such as Gay Pride, Indigenous Peoples Day, and Black History Month are important because they are explicit efforts at remembering, honoring, and celebrating the histories, people, and places that have traditionally been excluded from mainstream history. Preservation is power. To clarify how all of these things, memory, power, time, and preservation, connect to the creation of heritage and history, and ultimately to St. Eustatius, I'd like to reference a speech from Walida Imarisha, a scholar and artist based in Washington State, who, in her 2015 keynote speech to the graduates of Portland State University, entitled Sankofa Survival in Science Fiction, said, quote, "The past is never really past. What those who came before survived, what they protected, what they grew in hostile soil, that is as present as the air we are all breathing. all moments of time live as one. Right now, your past sits next to you. The present is holding your hand, while the future opens the door for you to walk through. End quote. The ways in which time moves for Imarisha means that every step we take is an echo of our ancestors and a dream towards our descendants. Another way of looking at this is that everything moves in tandem, together, and fluidly. Time in this way, as something fluid that connects us beyond the straight and linear nature of the here and now, and more broadly, as something that unfolds in a variety of directions, means that the things we remember and forget about the past have already altered our present and future. As an archaeologist, it is my job to explore the past and construct history from it. What this means, however, is that every time I excavate, conserve, and display artifacts, I also choose which stories the public has access to, and thus dictate what memories from the past we remember in the present and future, and which ones are silenced and lay dormant. In other words, our institutions of preservation, organizations purposely formed in order to save things from the past, like museums, archives, and preservation societies, ultimately dictate which histories we remember and which we forget, ensuring the survival of specific memories, people, places, and things into the present and future. The New York City AIDS Memorial reminds us of how deadly public fear, stigmatization, and miseducation can be, ensuring we have access to that knowledge and those memories in order to combat future instances of bigotry. Without access to those memories, our social and political responses to COVID-19 might have been drastically different. Thus, memory, power, and time are fused together through our institutions of preservation in order to create heritage and history. To echo Imarisha and Mark together, because we are a part of the universe, the past is never really past. Our actions have consequences, and thus preservation is power. So what does this all mean when we look at the history of St. Eustatius and Dutch American Heritage Day? Let me begin by saying that history and heritage are two different things. They are both built and constructed by people, but history is often created from documents. It is viewed as immobile chronological events of the past, stitched together like a story. Whereas heritage is understood to be more personal or community-based, encompassing the passed down food, language, stories, and cultural traditions of our ancestors. History often tells us stories in a strict linear fashion, how the past got us to the present, what you might imagine as an arrow, right? Beginning, end, excuse me. While heritage is more nonlinear, it ebbs and flows and is dependent upon both the past and the present day to ensure traditions are practiced in the future. You might say history progresses from A to B, whereas heritage unfolds itself. Let me repeat this again. History often tells us stories in a strict linear fashion, while heritage is more nonlinear. It is dependent on both the past and the present to ensure traditions survive and are practiced in the future. Public station history often begins in 1493 with Columbus encountering the island, represented by Columbus here on this timeline, and ends in 1781 with the British under Admiral Rodney, depicted here, attacking and pillaging the merchant community and exiling what was one of the region's oldest and largest Jewish communities off the island. There are a few notable dates within this timeline. 1636 refers to the Netherlands' official colonization of the island, represented here with Statia's official coat of arms. 1682 is when the Dutch West India Company formally takes control and transformed Statia into the Golden Rock, a free port where pirates, planters, and merchants from nearby islands freely traded sugar, indigo, and people with one another. And that on the timeline is represented with the Dutch West India Company's flag, their insignia and then colors. And finally, 1776, with the station salute of the American brig, the Andrew Doria, the first time the United States was officially recognized by a foreign power, and the reason we are here today on Dutch American Heritage Day, which is represented here by then Governor Johannes de Graaf, who was kind of responsible for the station salute to the Andrew Doria. You would be correct in stating that this history looks sparse. Where are the experiences of Native American people, the original inhabitants of the island who archaeology has shown settled on Statia nearly 2,000 years ago? What about the voices and memories of the women and children who lived in Upper and Lower Town? Or the experiences of both free and enslaved African people? Why are they not mentioned in this historical timeline? Additionally, Statia, like many other Caribbean islands, has a rich and for the most part unexplored history post-emancipation beginning in 1863. A history of autonomy, inter-Caribbean trade, and city life. This is a Eurocentric timeline, focusing on the white men who profited most from colonization, and thus, because it ends in 1781, labels any history post-1863 of Statia as an island in ruins, a poor, ungoverned, and forgotten island. I should add that the island's museum, government website, and CCAR's site touch upon other dates and timelines beyond the 1493 to 1781 period, but a majority of Statia's history is often focused on its Golden Rock era during the 18th century, really beginning as illustrated on this timeline from 1682 to 1781. Furthermore, a majority of Statia's preserved built environment comes directly from the 18th century, when the island's most profitable and largest trade was in the enslavement, exploitation, and sale of people of African descent. On the left, here's a picture of Fort Aranya in Oranjestad, which defended island slavers from pirates. In the center is the Dutch West India Company's insignia on one of their old warehouses, which actively participated in the slave trade, and I should add, was partially responsible for the Zwaanendael colony in Lewis. And finally, on the right is an image of the Dutch Reformed Church on the island, whose 18th century congregation welcomed slaveholders. Non-Eurocentric timelines, such as pre-colonial or even post-Dutch emancipation histories, are often hard to find, especially when looking at the island's preserved architecture today. This is somewhat shocking considering how over 85% of the island's population identifies as Black or of African descent. Additionally, this leads us to the questions: if Statia's history is predominantly one of European conquest and enslaving, what is Statia's heritage? And is it included within Dutch American Heritage Day? Like many Caribbean islands, Statia's heritage, the ancestral cultural traditions of its people, is creolized. It is a mixture of European, African, American, and Asian influences. It can be seen in the numerous languages spoken by its residents: English, Dutch, Spanish, and Papiamentu, an Iberian-based Creole language with similarities to both Spanish, Portuguese, Senegalese, and Cape Verdean languages. It can be seen in the island's local dishes, such as lamb roti, pictured here in the center, referencing Southeast Asian indentured servants and immigrants from India, and funchi, not pictured, a cornmeal mush similar to polenta, but made from maize, the traditional staple food of the pre-colonial Americas. Finally, and perhaps most notably, is Statia's Carnaval, which occurs from late July into early August every year and explicitly demonstrates Statian Creole heritage, from the drums used in Juvet to the colorful feathers that make up a majority of Carnival goers' outfits. I'd like to focus on Carnaval for just a moment, because in particular, Carnaval is, quote, a vehicle for transmitting and validating historical, social, and cultural traditions, and also ensures that these traditions and experiences contribute to the development of new ones, end quote. Carnaval pulls from African, American, European, and Asian influences. It relies upon African cultural knowledge and memory that survived the Middle Passage and enslavement, American costumes, art, and language that persevered against European colonization and violence, Asian musical traditions, most commonly found in Trinidad and Tobago, like the steel pan, that were distributed throughout the Caribbean, sometimes subversively, and European ideas surrounding masquerade balls and performance. Carnaval is heritage built from the senses and does not rely upon stone foundations and structures. In one part, because most Afro-Caribbean people were not allowed to legally own property until post-emancipation, thus limiting their ability to tie their history to an architectural structure, and also because the Caribbean heritage found in island forts, plantations, and warehouses is often publicly believed to reflect a European and white supremacist past, a past of pain, forced labor, and death. Carnaval, therefore, is a heritage of life, rejuvenation, resilience, and joy. It is a heritage of freedom. It is also indicative of an unfolding heritage, a flexible heritage that changes with time, one that is not tied down by zoning laws or preservation rules, but instead free to parade through the streets of its islands. The parade route through Oranjestad, the continued use of the Mike Van Putten Youth Center as festival grounds, and the dedication to freely showcasing local art, be it through music, fashion, or food, illustrates that participation in Statian Carnaval represents, quote, aspects of the struggle to ensure that it continues to live on and inspire new generations. It is in this act of living and regeneration that its true preservation occurs, end quote. This is a preservation not of stone, wood, or mortar, but again, of life, movement, fluidity, and joy, a preservation of freedom, a preservation, furthermore, of memory, memory that is nonlinear, that ebbs and flows, and is dependent upon both the past and present day in order to ensure traditions are practiced in the future. Station heritage, as illustrated by this collage I made, is living, breathing, and fluid. It flits between Europe and Africa, Asia and the Americas. It draws from past influences, such as African dance and American foodways, in order to produce new and exciting forms of cultural expression in the present. Through this nonlinear form of preservation, through active and creative preservation, Carnival ensures that the ancestors' cultural knowledge is accessible to future generations. While geographically, Statia might be a small place, it is in fact much larger through its culture, memory, and heritage. Because we are a part of the universe, the past is never really past, our actions have consequences, and thus preservation is power. Finally, let us now turn towards the question of Dutch American Heritage Day and its station implications. The oft-repeated tale of the Andrew Doria tells us that upon entering Oranjestad Bay on November 16, 1776, and flying the flag of the Second Continental Congress, illustrated here in this painting, so here's the Andrew Doria, the flag, Second Continental Congress, the ship's captain, Isaiah Robinson, fired 13 cannon shot for the 13 colonies to signal their arrival. The island's governor at the time, pictured on the right, Johannes de Graaf, responded in turn with 11 shot, thereby acknowledging the United States' independence from Britain. This painting is also illustrating, we have the quill here, and then Fort Aranya, here's Lower Town as well, just to give you some context. Dutch American Heritage Day is still seen as a political opportunity for the two nations to meet and talk. These meetings, however, normally happen either in The Hague or DC, away from the volcanic shores of Statia. Furthermore, while Statia is often mentioned in stories about the day, cultural focus tends to shift towards the windmills, banks, and tulips of the continental European Netherlands, seemingly excluding the island responsible for the holiday, and separating it and its people from what is considered quote unquote standard or traditional Dutch heritage and culture. St. Eustatius, however, is a Dutch municipality and a part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Likewise, the wealth generated through its 17th, 18th, and 19th century merchants and plantation owners, as in the money they made by predominantly buying, selling, and enslaving people of African descent, tremendously aided the Netherlands in becoming the nation it is today. Returning to Statia's political standing within the Netherlands, alongside its public history and preserved historic architecture, illustrated by Fort Oranje on the left, here, there seems to be a larger narrative at play, a narrative of preservation that sees the Dutch through institutional power or institutions of preservation, attempt to control how time and memory operate within the island. While Carnaval, pictured on the right, and other aspects of station heritage represent fissures in the linearity of history and time, they cannot erase the fact that administrative power for the island still lies in the hands of The Hague. The local station government defers to the Netherlands. Thus, the past is never really past. Preservation is political, and preservation is power. Thank you.
Fran, thank you so much for that really engaging discussion. I do have a couple of questions that some folks have asked, so I'll go ahead and read those for you. And to everybody else, if you have any questions and you are on the Zoom and you would like to put those in the Q&A or the chat, please do. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And if you're watching us on Facebook and you'd like to put some questions in the comments, feel free to do that. We'll try to get to those too. So Fran, the first question that we have here is, have you talked or worked with Chuck Vivian, who was the archaeologist on the Duroc and was Rev War reenactor and historian?
Could you repeat the name again?
Chuck Vivian.
No, I have not.
Yeah, so Chuck actually was instrumental in the salvage of the Duroc, which is our local shipwreck here. He used to be the archaeologist with us as part of Delawre's Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs. He has since moved on to grand things, but he does occasionally check in on us. So for the folks who answered that question, Fran may not have, but we have occasionally worked with Chuck here at the Zwaanendael Museum for sure. And he's still a huge part of that research. Let me scroll up here and get another question. I know I saw one. Oh, somebody asks here or mentions that they've read a little bit about the Jewish population throughout the Caribbean, and could you speak to that sort of loosely, a bit more broadly?
Sure, I could maybe, at least for St. Eustatius and a little bit for, I want to say St. Thomas also had a pretty sizable Jewish population. The station population was mostly merchants. And the thing that kind of makes Statia special, I guess, about its Jewish history is that the 18th century synagogue is still standing. It's in ruins, but there is still kind of the basic form. And then there's also a mikvah, kind of ceremonial bath that also remains as well. So when Rodney attacked the island in 1781, he ousted, exiled the Jewish community. So some went to St. Martin, which is nearby, and then others went to Curacao.
No idea. Let's see, I have another question here. What was the connection between the Dutch West India Trading Company and Eustatius?
Yeah, so they were backers of the original colony settlement, and you might be able to speak to this more. But so essentially, the money kind of necessary, a portion of the money necessary for the colonization of what is now Lewis, was at the hands of the Dutch West India Company. That's
pretty much it. Yeah, so the first settlement here by the Dutch, at least, was Zwaanendael, and that was paid for by the Dutch West India Company. They also sort of fronted the people responsible for doing the research and eventually coming out.
And then another kind of, this is maybe more like a broader connection between Statia and Delaware itself. This is, I don't even know if you could say connection, but the Andrew Doria left from Philly as well on its way down to Statia. So it would have sailed past Lewis on that trip as well.
I don't see any questions on our Facebook. I think that's about it. Oh, someone does ask, with that in mind, does that mean that Lewis had an active slave trade?
I know for the 17th century, no. And I'm not too sure. I would say Lewis was not a slave port, but there were enslaved people. I want to say Sussex County had a pretty sizable enslaved population in terms of the 3 Delaware counties. But it wasn't like Newport or Charleston, which were major kind of slave trading hubs where a lot of people from Africa, from West Africa, and then from the Caribbean were actually transported to and then sold for elsewhere.
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that. So north of us, the Wilmington area was very active. So certainly any ship that goes to Wilmington is passing Lewis. So in that way, Lewis was very deeply connected, potentially helping those boats resupply and things like that. But as far as an actual port, not so much. Although, as Fran says, many people were enslaved in the area that is now Lewis and throughout Sussex County. Certainly. But thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Fran. And we hope we'll see you guys virtually or in person at the next one.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Caitlin.